behaviour by the high-profile presenter raised fresh questions about his conduct. BBC News has contacted the presenter directly and via his lawyer, but has received no response to these latest allegations. So that is the breaking news this afternoon here on Sky News. Fresh claims from a second young person involving the unnamed male BBC presenter. Just to run you through this latest statement again, the information we're getting from the BBC is this person is not known to the young person involved in the original claims made to the BBC and the Sun newspaper. This is entirely a separate set of allegations, and the two complainants are not known to each other. We are hearing a little bit more now, actually. OK, more on those fresh claims. After the young person, the presenter, had first connected on the dating app, the conversation moved to other platforms. At this stage, the presenter revealed his identity and told the young person not to tell anyone. Later, the young person alluded online to having contact with a BBC presenter and implied they would name him at some point. The presenter reacted by sending a number of threatening messages, which BBC News has seen. So let's just run you through what we know at this point. A young person has told BBC News that they felt threatened by the BBC presenter at the centre of a row over payment for sexually explicit photos. The individual in their early 20s was first contacted anonymously by the male presenter on a dating app. They said they were put under pressure to meet up, but never did. When the young person hinted online they might name the presenter, they were sent abusive, expletive-filled messages. Speaking to BBC News, the young person, who has no connection to the person at the centre of the Sun story about payment for photos, said they had been scared by the power the presenter held. They said the threats made in the messages had frightened them, and they remain scared. The new allegations of menacing and bullying behaviour by the high-profile presenter raise fresh questions about his conduct. BBC News has contacted the presenter directly and via his lawyers, but has received no response to the latest allegations. This is a statement from the BBC. I'll go on to read you the next part of it. It says, after the two had first connected on the dating app, the conversation moved to other platforms. At this stage, the presenter revealed his identity and told the young person not to tell anyone. Later, the young person alluded online to having contact with a BBC presenter and implied they would name him at some point. The presenter reacted by sending a number of threatening messages, which BBC News has seen. BBC News has been able to verify that the messages were sent from a phone number belonging to the presenter. The young person's online post has also been seen by BBC News. Now, claims about the unnamed BBC presenter first surfaced in the Sun newspaper last week. It was on Friday night. These are the first set of allegations. Just to remind you, the Sun newspaper quoted a mother as saying her child, who is now 20, had been asked for explicit photos by this unnamed male TV presenter and was paid tens of thousands of pounds for it. The BBC has now paused its own investigation into those allegations while the police assess information they have. There is no police investigation at this stage. Right, let's bring in our home editor, Jason Farrell, who's in our central London studio for us. So, Jason, just to be clear, these are separate allegations from a separate young person, but about the same BBC presenter.
Yes, and one wonders how the BBC is going to react to this, because they've, of course, been asked to pause their investigation into this one individual, but now this is a separate set of allegations, not necessarily criminal. This is a person who is in their 20s. They've met, according to the BBC, in a private messaging group, and this person says that they were surprised to find out who it was. Obviously, it was initially an anonymous conversation they were having, but then this presenter, apparently, according to the BBC, revealed themselves to this person. That's what we're hearing. And that there were repeated messages pressuring this person to meet up, which didn't happen. But when this person alluded to the idea that they might name this person online, they were sent a number of abusive, expletive-filled messages, and they were scared by the power of the presenter, that the presenter held, and that the threats frightened them, and that they remained scared about this. The BBC saying there that they believe that they have evidence that this did come from this particular presenter's phone. So a suggestion then that there is a kind of like a pattern of behaviour, if you like, from this presenter that's been shown in this second example, and that will no doubt add to this investigation. But as I say, I'm not quite sure how they will marry these two together, because currently the police have asked the BBC to pause their investigation whilst their internal BBC investigation, while the police do their own scoping exercise around the initial allegations made in The Sun to see whether there was any criminality. And just to be clear, the allegations in The Sun are that this same presenter with a different individual asked them to send explicit photographs when they were under the age of 18, and that would be a criminal offence.
Jason, let's just talk about what we know about these new claims. The BBC have put out a statement, and this second person first made contact with the TV presenter on a dating app. Just remind us what we know happened from that point on.
Yeah, that's right. So what we understand is that clearly this presenter's gone onto a dating app. They've contacted someone in their early 20s. This is a kind of a contact that's done anonymously through the app. We haven't let's see what the app actually was, and that they've kind of then gone into a private messaging domain in which they've been able to have private conversations. And it seems to be during that period that the presenter has actually revealed who they are. And at that point, has sort of suggested that they meet up, and the person saying that they were surprised at who it was but decided not to meet up, and then they get this pressure, these threatening messages, these expletive-filled messages that the BBC say that they've seen and can verify came from that presenter's phone. I think that is a worrying development for whoever this is, and a worrying development for the BBC. And that point, that person has become scared, saying that this person is, has certain authority, and says that they continue to be scared about this. So we get the idea then that this is an unwanted advances that have become quite difficult, particularly when that person has threatened to perhaps go public and say who this person is. Then it's become even more aggressive, and that at that point they felt very scared, and they've obviously decided to contact the BBC about this, and they've spoken to a BBC reporter.
Jason, thank you. This second young person has made direct contact with BBC News. We understand the BBC has seen the contact between the unnamed presenter and this second young person. They have verified that the phone number used for some of the messages does belong to the BBC presenter. They say they have contacted the presenter in question directly and via his lawyer, but has received no response to these latest allegations. Let's just run you through what we know. If you're just tuning in to Sky News, we've had fresh information within the last few minutes. This information dropping just after 4 o'clock. New claims from a second young person levelled at the unnamed male BBC presenter at the heart of this latest BBC scandal. This is the information we have. A young person has told BBC News they felt threatened by the BBC presenter at the centre of this row over payment for sexually explicit photos. The individual in their early 20s
yeah, I'm good, how are you?
Was first contacted anonymously by the male presenter on a dating app. They say they were put under pressure to meet up, but never did. When the young person hinted online that they might name the presenter, they were sent abusive, expletive-filled messages. Speaking to BBC News, the young person, who has no connection to the person at the centre of the Sun newspaper's stories about payments for photos, said they had been scared by the power the presenter held. They said the threats made in the messages had frightened them, and they remain scared. The new allegations of menacing and bullying behaviour by the high-profile presenter raise fresh questions about his conduct. BBC News has contacted the presenter directly and his lawyer, but as yet has received no response to these latest allegations. After the young person and the presenter had first connected on the dating app, the conversation moved on to other platforms. At this stage, the presenter revealed his identity and told the young person not to tell anyone. Later, that young person alluded online to having contact with a BBC presenter and implied they would name him at some point. The presenter reacted by sending a number of threatening messages, which BBC News has seen. Let's just have a look at some more information. The BBC has also been able to verify that the messages were sent from a phone number belonging to the presenter. This is BBC News putting that information out there. The young person's online post, in which they alluded to the fact that they might name the presenter publicly, has also been seen by BBC News. You'll remember that claims about this unnamed BBC presenter first surfaced in tabloid newspapers last week. The Sun newspaper quoted a mother who said that her child, who is now 20, had been given money by the unnamed male BBC presenter in exchange for explicit photos. That money had been used to fund a drug habit, and the mother was concerned that their child would wind up dead. It's important to point out that a lawyer for the young person at the centre of this first set of allegations has since said that the accusations were rubbish. The family, however, are standing by their account. The BBC today has been defending its handling of its own investigation into the allegations. BBC Director General Tim Davie giving an interview earlier on this afternoon, explaining the timeline of events since the allegations were made to the BBC back in May, right up until what we have seen today when the BBC met police. No police investigation is underway at the moment, but police are looking at evidence. The presenter was suspended on Sunday, you may remember, but is not being named because of concerns about defamation and breaching his privacy. The BBC, it must be said, has paused its own internal investigation into what happened while police examine the matter in more detail. I'm just checking to see if any more information has come in from the BBC. As I said, that has come in within the last few minutes, but we've had no further updates. Let's speak to Sky's Sadia Chowdhury, who's at BBC headquarters in central London. So, Sadia, we're just getting our head around this first set of allegations, and now a second young person has come forward, presumably because they've been seeing what's been unfolded on media channels over the last few days, and these allegations of a serious nature as well.
Yeah, we don't know if they have any sort of criminal attachment to it, but it certainly is very serious. It's a significant development on a day when the BBC is already in crisis. And I think it's important to note what the Director General Tim Davie of the BBC said earlier today when he was asked in that interview that he gave on if there are any other allegations against this presenter that he's aware of. During that interview, he said, because this is a subject of an active police discussion in terms of them looking forward, what they want to do going forward, I absolutely cannot comment. So he didn't confirm it, and nor did he deny it. And at that time, I think a few of us were wondering why he didn't deny it. It was quite an important line, I think, in that interview. Now, we don't know a lot of detail about these new allegations. We don't know any time frames and if there was any overlap, but it is a second allegation, which, of course, makes this much more serious. And one would expect that this might be information that the BBC should then pass on to the police. Now, just a reminder, the police, there is no investigation underway. They've asked the BBC to pause their investigation, the BBC's investigation. So we don't know if this new bit of information may actually change any of that. But certainly it sounds like there's a bit of a fallout now at the BBC where they've tried to get in touch with this presenter, one of their own, directly and via his lawyers, and not been able to get in touch. And another thing that Tim Davie spoke about in that interview was he was asked if he himself had spoken to this presenter. He said he hadn't. He'd left it to very senior management to speak to him. But he was asked what was the presenter's response when those managers did speak to him, and did he deny the allegations in the Sun newspaper against him. And Tim Davie said, I'm not going to get into that conversation that we had with the presenter. So he didn't want to talk about whether or not this presenter has accepted any liability for what has happened. Perhaps the bit that people will feel most uncomfortable is about this point about the power that the presenter appears to have held over these individuals. I'll just read out to you. This is from the BBC's website. It says the new allegations of menacing and bullying behaviour by the high-profile presenter raise fresh questions about his conduct. That's quite strongly worded from the BBC, and surely now they will be under even more pressure to name him.
Sadia, yeah, that is something that remains to be seen, doesn't it? We understand it is a duty of care undertaken by any employer to an employee, which has stopped the BBC from naming the presenter, and also the presenter's right to privacy. We'll see how that develops over the course of this afternoon, this evening, and in the coming days. In terms of the BBC catching up with this, if you like, because we've had the timeline of events, haven't we, about this first set of allegations, the criticism being they were too slow to act. The Director General himself said, look, you know, we need to learn from this. Red flags should have been raised immediately. They're now very much coming on the front foot on this, aren't they? These new claims out within the hour.
Yeah, I mean, the spotlight will be now on how the BBC deals with this, because so far today we've been talking about whether or not they were quick enough when it came to the first set of allegations. And if you look at that timeline of the first set of allegations, actually, once the complaint was made, the BBC the very next day tried to get in touch, tried to make verification on who they were dealing with, the complainant, to check if they are really who they say they are. So at the beginning it seemed to be very quick, progressing really quick, and somewhere along there it just sort of like tailed off. This time one would hope the BBC, having just today the Director General saying that lessons need to be learned in terms of that time frame, how quickly they will act. And by issuing this statement, it seems fairly promptly, it seems like maybe those lessons are being learnt very quickly, but the spotlight is on the BBC right now. It is under a lot of pressure to move forward quickly with the way it handles complaints, and this sounds like a very serious complaint. We don't know, again, if it is of the similar sort of criminal, potentially criminal nature of the first complaint, but certainly the words used, the strongly worded used about bullying and having power over a presenter indicate that it should be taken very, very seriously, especially because young people have been involved.
OK, Sadia, thank you, Sadia Chowdhury, bringing us up to date with the latest developments. That breaking news, a fresh set of claims from a second person, claims against the unnamed male BBC presenter at the centre of this scandal engulfing the corporation. We have heard from the Metropolitan Police today about this story, confirming that they asked the BBC to pause its internal investigation while detectives assess the claims from the first set of allegations. Let's bring in our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, who's at Scotland Yard. Martin, this fresh set of claims, on the surface, just looking through what the BBC have put out there in this statement, do you think there's any suggestion that these claims will form part of the police's inquiries?
Be odd if they didn't, I think. We don't know exactly when this second complaint was received by the BBC, and it may well be that it was part of the discussion between the Beeb and Scotland Yard detectives in that virtual meeting yesterday. If it wasn't, if it's come in since, then I'm sure that in the same way the first allegations were laid out to the detectives, then I'm sure this complaint, albeit of a different nature, but about the same presenter, I'm sure that will be part of the assessment that detectives are just embarking on. We don't know quite exactly the form of that assessment. There don't seem to be any hard and fast rules, but it's not an investigation. It's not a formal investigation, so there'll be no arrest warrants, there'll be no search warrants, there'll be no formal interviews. But I think what this big development does is to put a bit more pressure on Scotland Yard to come to a quick decision. Now, yesterday, when we were told that Scotland Yard were assessing it ahead of any potential investigation, we all thought, well, this could take some weeks. It's not going to be done ever so quickly, but I think it does add some urgency to a Scotland Yard decision whether to open a formal investigation. But they are, on the face of it, what we've been told so far, they are allegations, the two of them, of a rather different nature. Both, I'd have thought, potentially criminal. Certainly this new allegation does suggest the possibility of a crime such as malicious communications. But again, like so much of this story, we don't know the full details.
OK, Martin, thank you. Martin Brunt with the latest there from Scotland Yard. Let's just recap the latest information we have. This was released by the BBC around 20 minutes ago. Fresh set of allegations against the unnamed male BBC presenter that's at the centre of this scandal. The information we have is that threatening messages were sent by the presenter to a second young person. This is after the young person, the presenter, had first connected on a dating app. The conversation then moved to other platforms. At this stage, the presenter revealed his identity and told the young person not to tell anyone. Later, the young person alluded online to having contact with a BBC presenter and implied they would name him at some point. The presenter reacted by sending a number of threatening messages, which BBC News has seen. This young person took this information to BBC News. BBC News has seen these threatening messages and has verified that the phone number that sent those threatening messages does belong to the unnamed BBC presenter. Let's bring in our home editor, Jason Farrell, who's following the story from our central London studio. Jason, your thoughts on these fresh set of allegations?
Well, I think one thing it shows is that the corporation's corporate investigation team is being outpaced by its own journalists, because if you look at how the corporate investigation handled the initial complaint back in May, and it took them 7 weeks to actually even contact the presenter, they weren't able to follow up the phone call with a phone call, the emails wasn't responded to, they weren't able to stand things up. Here, we've had an allegation that's come into a journalist. They've been able to verify the phone number, they've got hold of the messages, they've spoken to the individuals concerned, they've tried to get hold of the presenter to get a response, they've spoken to their lawyers. It's all happened very quickly, and that's what I mean. The BBC essentially being outpaced. The Director General asked about this earlier this morning, about whether or not there would be other allegations. There were other allegations. He couldn't answer that. But it does look like, it just demonstrates that these things can be done, actually, that these things can be done quite quickly. I mean, obviously, we've only got the BBC's word for that at this stage, but they are saying very much that they feel that these allegations do stack up. They stand up, and they've tried to get a response from the presenter concerned. And I think the second thing, obviously, is it's adding more mud to the situation. Whether or not it is a criminal offence or not, we don't know just how nasty those texts were, how intimidating they were for the individual. We don't know the exact circumstances of what was said at this stage, but it does make it more difficult, I think, as Sadie was saying, for this thing to just remain as it is, as a status. I think for a while it was thought, well, maybe now there'll be a pause. The BBC are pausing its investigation. There'll be a pause while the police do their investigation, and maybe not much would happen. And yet here we are. There's another twist. It's quite a different twist to the one we had yesterday, because in a sense, the one yesterday was more in the BBC's favour. Here was the young person who was featured in the Sun article saying that nothing had happened, that there was no criminality, there was nothing untoward, using their lawyer to make that statement. But in some ways, even that has caused problems for the BBC now, because when the Director General was asked, well, do you know whether the presenter had contacted the young person about this, maybe even paid the lawyer's fees, the Director General wasn't able to answer that question. And big questions as well around why the Director General hasn't actually spoken personally to the presenter at the centre of this. So, yes, it just adds more mud, more difficulty for the BBC in what was already a very difficult situation.
Yeah, question marks remain over any criminality in what's been unfolding over recent days, Jason. That's up to the police to decide. They are looking at evidence. There is no police investigation happening at the moment. But in terms of this BBC presenter and conduct, I mean, we've not seen these threatening messages. BBC News have. They will, I'm sure, pass them on to police to decide if there's anything for them to investigate when it comes to those. But it's the conduct of this BBC presenter that's now being called into question. BBC News saying they have contacted this presenter and his lawyer, but have got no response. That is going to be the unfolding story in the coming days, isn't it, Jason, as to whether this presenter is named and whether there is any way back for him.
I think this is the thing. There's been quite a big silence now for quite some time. There's not been a denial. There's not been a partial denial even around this. The first allegation, and now the BBC is saying they've getting stony silence over this one as well. You might not expect them to react immediately, but I think that pressure will grow. I think the pressure will grow for some sort of response. Does it remain as a suspension? And the BBC have already worried about the way in which this has impacted on other presenters, presenters who've done nothing wrong, who've been named libelously on social media. So there are a lot of things that kind of hang around this allegation. And if there's one, I'm sure there will be people looking for others as well. So is this the beginning of a proof of a kind of a way in which this presenter has been behaving over a period of time with other people, and whether there are more allegations. Obviously, the Director General was asked about that and wasn't able to answer that question and didn't want to answer that question at this stage. So we don't know whether there have been other formal complaints against this presenter at this time. That's not being revealed. And I think whilst there is so much uncertainty around this story and still so much not even made absolutely clear about the things that have been put out there by the Sun newspaper, not all of those things have been made clear as to exactly what the BBC knew at exactly what time. I think it gets harder and harder for them to do nothing, if you like, which is, I think, what they might have done had things stayed static, because they might have just said, well, the police have told us to pause this investigation at this stage. That's what we're going to do. I mean, they might still stay with that line, but I think it gets harder.
OK, Jason, thank you. Jason Farrell, our home editor there. Just to recap the breaking news, the fresh information coming from the BBC about new claims against the unnamed BBC presenter. This is from a second young person. Threatening messages were sent by that presenter to a young person after they first connected on a dating app. The conversation then moved to other platforms. At this stage, the presenter revealed his identity and asked that young person not to tell anyone. Later, the young person alluded online to having contact with a BBC presenter and implied that they would name him at some point. And the presenter reacted to that by sending a number of threatening messages. The BBC News team that have this information say they have seen those messages and they have verified that the number those messages were sent from is the number of that BBC presenter. BBC News also saying they have contacted the presenter directly and also his lawyer, but as yet have had no response. We'll be talking more about this after the break. We'll also be getting the view of a media lawyer. What happens next in this story? We'll talk about it after the break. Hello, welcome back. If you're expecting Ian King live, we are continuing to follow the developing and breaking news regarding the BBC. So Ian King's programme is on our digital platforms. You can see the side panel there on your screen. If you scan that QR code, you can find Ian. Sorry for any inconvenience caused about that. But we're going to stick with this BBC story because it's developed over the last half an hour or so. There's a fresh set of allegations facing the unnamed male BBC presenter, and they come from a second young person, totally unconnected to the allegations that surfaced last week. This is what we know at this point in the afternoon. The BBC presenter sent threatening messages to a young person in their early 20s. According to the BBC, the presenter met the young person first on a dating app before their conversations moved to other platforms. The presenter involved then revealed his identity and asked the young person not to tell anyone. The young person later posted online alluding to having had contact with a BBC presenter and hinted that they might name him. The presenter involved then allegedly sent the young person a number of threatening messages, which the BBC says it has seen and confirm come from a phone number belonging to the presenter. The young person involved said they felt threatened by these messages and they remain scared. BBC News says it has contacted the presenter involved directly. They have also contacted his lawyer, but they have received no response to these new allegations. Well, the BBC Director General, Tim Davie, gave his first and only interview about this matter to BBC Radio 4's World at One programme earlier on today. He was asked if he knew about any more allegations. Here's what he said.
And have there been any other allegations or complaints made against the same presenter?
Because this is a subject of an active police discussion in terms of them looking forward, looking at what they want to do going forward, absolutely, I cannot comment on that.
OK, let's speak now to media law consultant David Banks. David, thank you very much for jumping on to speak to us about this breaking news. What do you make about this new set of allegations? How does this feed into the overall picture?
Well, as this was happening, as your colleagues called me, I was literally writing a piece for the Indie, and I was typing the words, "There are more twists to this story," and then we get this happening. I think it does change things quite considerably. I think one thing we saw happen at the weekend, we saw the kind of social media mob attacking the BBC. Then when we got the statement yesterday from the young person at the centre of it, a subsection of the mob then started attacking the Sun. Now this might well give some support to the Sun's decision to cover this story, because if you get a totally separate allegation by a completely separate person, and this person hasn't gone to tabloid newspapers who some people might argue have got an agenda against the BBC, this person has gone to the BBC themselves, and the BBC have investigated this, the BBC have seen the messages, the BBC are publishing the story, then it puts a very different light on things. It also plays into this idea of privacy. You know, that people have a right to privacy when allegations are being investigated. And it might give weight to those who say there is a public interest argument to identify the person involved in this. Now, we have to look carefully at the allegation here. I mean, the initial thing that this person was contacted on a dating app, that's a legal thing to do, you know, and this person was overage by the looks of things. You know, they're in their early 20s now. So there's no suggestion of illegality there or anything like that. I think it's what happens next that is possibly causing some concern. It's the nature of the messages. Of course, we don't know what the wording is, so we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? In this first set of allegations, there was some allegation of criminality in terms of the young person involved being under the age of 18 and being asked to send explicit images. Of course, none of this has been proven. Police are looking at that. That's up to them to look at and decide whether there's a police investigation. There isn't one at the moment. These fresh set of allegations, I mean, you quite rightly point out that we haven't seen the so-called threatening messages. BBC News has, and presumably they are passing them onto police. And that, again, may be a matter for police to investigate. But the big question here is about the presenter's conduct. BBC have paused their internal investigation and they have talked a lot about the presenter's privacy. Now, that is going to be a big issue in this, isn't there? Because there is the complainant and then there is, of course, the person at the centre of this. And legally, where does all of that stand now in terms of the BBC has suspended this presenter? What happens next? Legally, where is this presenter standing?
Well, obviously, I think that the main thing that's happening now is the Metropolitan Police assessment of the situation, and clearly the information now given to them by the BBC will be something that they will be taking into consideration. Again, we don't know the content of the messages, so we don't know whether they are of a nature that they would trigger some sort of criminal investigation. Messages on social media can take all forms, and we don't know what the words used were or what the threatening nature of them was, as being reported by the BBC. So we have to see what the Metropolitan Police decide about this. But I think those who are investigating or looking at the course of conduct of this presenter might be arguing that if there's this one person who's come forward, just on what we've heard so far, where we've had everything, anonymised, although an awful lot has been said on social media, if this one other person has come forward, could there potentially be other people out there? And is there therefore an argument for identification in these circumstances? That's what people who argue it's in the public interest to identify will be saying. Others who take a more strict view of privacy will be saying, no, the investigation's going on. People know to come forward if they've been approached by anyone at the BBC, and their allegation will be investigated without this person's identity being revealed. So there will be arguments on both sides regarding to identification.
Presumably, the high-profile BBC presenter has a good legal team around him. If you were part of that team, what would you be advising him to do? Because there has been silence from the presenter.
Well, I think I'd be looking very carefully at the information that was coming in and the nature of this contact and what exactly has been said. I think that given the fact that the police are now examining the issue, I'm not sure that I'd be advising to go out making any public statements until that police investigation has taken its course. And I would be conscious that sometimes public statements by people in this situation can prompt others to come forward saying things against you. So it might not have the effect that one wants.
OK, thank you very much for speaking to us here on Sky News. We really appreciate your time. I'm going to head now to Scotland Yard. Our crime correspondent Martin Brunt is there for us this afternoon. And Martin, these fresh allegations have been made. It's interesting. I've just been looking where the news has been released on the BBC, and it's been released by BBC News, not the corporation itself, which would suggest that this young person went directly to the news department to talk about these claims. How does it feed into what the police are doing? Because the police have pointed out today that they asked the BBC to pause their internal investigation. Will that have any bearing on that?
I'm sure that this latest allegation will become part of the information that Scotland Yard are assessing. It's not clear from what the BBC have said in the last hour when this new allegation came in. I mean, I suppose we will think it must be sometime over the past 24 hours. If it was, then perhaps it was part of the discussions that the detectives had yesterday when they met, albeit virtually, with BBC representatives. If it's come in since, then I'm sure by now it will have been passed to the police. It would be odd for them not to be considering this as part of that general assessment. But of course it is a new allegation that's of quite a different nature to the original allegation. And if there is any criminality attached to this second claim, then I guess the police will consider the possibility, for instance, of a potential crime of malicious communication. But again, we don't know the strength of this allegation. It talks broadly of threats, abusive messages. We don't know how threatening those messages are, or at least the recipient, how much he or she felt threatened by those messages. All of that will, of course, become part of the assessment and will contribute to the eventual decision by detectives whether to turn either of these allegations into a formal criminal investigation.
OK, Martin, thank you. Martin Brunt with the latest there from Scotland Yard regarding the Met Police's involvement in this developing story. Let's bring in now Liam Cottrey, who's a criminal defence lawyer. Liam, thanks so much for joining us here on Sky News this afternoon. In light of this new set of allegations, if they are passed over to police, what will they be looking at?
Well, I think your previous correspondent described the situation quite clearly. Unfortunately, there are lots of ifs, buts, maybes in this situation, and we don't really know exactly what's going on. It is interesting that the BBC took so long to confront this matter previously, then all of a sudden it seems to be all hands on deck as soon as another allegation comes along. But malicious communications, as your correspondent stated, Section 1 of the Malicious Communications Act 1988, is probably what would apply in this situation, which is when any person sends to another person a message which is a threat in this situation. There are other circumstances where this section would come into force, but it seems to be the situation here. Now, whether or not that really amounts to a threat as such is a whole other matter. We'd need to see much more information before we can really get into that. And of course, if there is an investigation going on at this time, I do see breaking news scrolling across your screen saying that the Met Police say there is not an investigation going on. But of course, the BBC say that they've paused their investigation for the police. So one wonders who, in fact, is investigating at this time. I guess that remains to be seen. Yeah, the police's line is they're looking at the information they've been given by the BBC before they decide whether to launch a police investigation. It's quite wordy, but it all comes down to the same thing. Police are involved. Let's go back to that first set of allegations that emerged at the back end of last week, emerged late on Friday night. And that is the potential criminal element involved in all of this. And that got more complicated yesterday when the young person at the centre of these allegations, of course, the complaint was made by their mother and stepfather, not by them themselves. The young person came out and said, this is all rubbish. Legally, how does that complicate what their parents are trying to do? Well, I guess it doesn't really matter what anyone's trying to do. What matters is what the evidence says. If the police have the evidence to investigate and even charge someone with a crime, then they will. And this is the kind of offence, when I say this is the kind of offence, let's talk about what particular offence we may be dealing with. One, it may be that, let's give an example. If there were someone who received messages intentionally, someone who was an adult, from someone who was 17 years old, then that person would be guilty of possession of indecent images of children, even though that person was 17, as long as they are under 18. Now, this person may well be in their 20s now. This may have been going on a long time, and one may consider whether or not that it is in the public interest to continue with the investigation or any prosecution. But that's at the side right now. What the police would have to prove is that this person has been in possession of those indecent images. And at this time, just an allegation saying that these things have happened is not evidence enough to charge. Certainly evidence enough to investigate, perhaps speak to the person, interview the person, perhaps even look at electronic devices that they may have to see if there's any examples of such images. But here, as it stands, this is very early days, and what may be happening from here on out, who knows?
If you were part of the legal team advising this unnamed male BBC presenter, what would you be saying to them? Because, of course, it may be that the police find nothing, they find no evidence to trigger a police investigation, in which case, you know, it comes down to conduct, reputation, their career, all those other questions that are outside the legal sphere. What would you be saying to them right now, looking at this long term?
Well, it's always terrifying at the early stages of these kinds of cases because you just don't know what you're dealing with. And people contact proactive lawyers like me, wanting us to get stuck into the case, show that they're innocent or make the case go away so they can get on with their lives that they were continuing before. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. The best thing to do at this time would be wait for anyone who's dealing with this kind of situation. Because when we are in these circumstances, we need to see exactly what we're up against before we make any positive moves. It would be wrong for anyone to try and do anything else at this stage if there is a criminal investigation going on.
Liam, just a reminder to people watching, we touched on the Malicious Communications Act, which, you know, we said maybe in relation to this fresh set of allegations, the police might be looking at the threatening messages the presenter sent to the second young person under that act. But of course, there's a separate story going on to this, and that's what's unfolding on social media. We've seen another BBC face today put out a video on social media joking about it, saying, you know, well, he was joking about it, but basically he was saying that, you know, £35,000 allegedly paid by this presenter to that young person, they'd be quite happy to spend that on suing someone for defamation online, because that's what's going on at the moment. Names being put on social media and Twitter and social media users not realising the consequences of what they're doing, or, you know, perhaps not realising the seriousness of it.
Yes, and but it has been the case that social media users have gone to prison for things like this. People need to be so careful when they are discussing these things on social media if there are police investigations ongoing. But at best, it's irresponsible. At worst, it could seriously prejudice an investigation into incredibly serious sexual offence. So these things should always be taken seriously, and police will be monitoring these things. If anything comes to light, and regardless of defamation of those innocent in these situations, and the BBC presenter who is the protagonist in this situation may well be innocent. So we may all have to be very careful about how we deal with these things.
Yeah, it's not worth a prison sentence for trying to be funny or clever
Certainly
online.
not.
OK. Liam Cottery, really appreciate the benefit of your expertise this afternoon. Thank you for reacting to our breaking news. The breaking news is there's a fresh set of allegations against the unnamed male BBC presenter. The allegations say that he sent threatening messages to a young person, this young person being in their early 20s. They first made contact on a dating app. It moved to other platforms. The presenter then revealed his identity and asked that young person not to tell anyone. But later on one of these platforms, the young person alluded to the fact that they were in contact with a BBC presenter and may well reveal who that presenter was. The result of that was that that presenter got in touch with them and sent threatening messages. The young person involved said it made them feel threatened and scared to this day. Let's bring in our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, who's at Scotland Yard. Martin, we touched on the fact that, you know, how could these second set of allegations not be looked at by police? But in terms of the evidence that police are gathering to decide whether there's a police investigation, how long might that take?
It's not the first time that the Metropolitan Police has decided to do an assessment, a scoping exercise, if you like, ahead of a decision to launch or not to launch a formal criminal investigation. And they tend to do this particularly around high-profile investigations. They don't want to be seen to be rushing into anything at the same time. They don't equally want to be accused, as the BBC has, of dragging their feet. It's impossible to say how long it will take. It's going to take longer now than it was going to take yesterday, because they do have this second allegation to look at, and we don't know what the evidence for that is, although the BBC is suggesting that it does have some firm evidence of it, enough for it to report in the last hour or so around this second allegation. And in the last few minutes, the BBC has reported something else, saying that an unnamed police force got a complaint in April. It spoke, the force, I think it means, that force spoke to the Metropolitan Police That's not unusual, and it spoke to the BBC, and the upshot was a decision that there was no criminality involved. Now that rather corroborates the report in The Sun today, which quotes the child, this is the child behind, whose parents were behind the first allegation. The stepfather, according to The Sun, had contacted police in the early stages of this story and was told there was no criminality. This story is getting rather complicated even as I'm relaying it. So another development there. But the upshot is the Metropolitan Police is doing an assessment, and we don't know quite what form that assessment will take, but it won't be a formal investigation. There'll be no arrest warrants, no search warrants, no formal interviews. But I think what is happening now is that the Metropolitan Police is perhaps under a little more pressure to come to a quick conclusion about both these allegations, whether they should be turned into criminal investigations. They might not be.
Martin, thank you. 7 o'clock tonight, we have a special programme for you looking at all the big questions about these allegations surrounding a BBC presenter, including these fresh claims from a second person that have emerged this afternoon. That's at 7 right here on Sky News. We just had this line from the Prime Minister's press secretary. It says that anyone who's been a victim in the nature of these allegations, that of course we would call on, basically the press secretary is saying we would call on people who have allegations to come forward to ensure that they are supported and their claims looked into. That's the press secretary of the Prime Minister reacting to those fresh set of allegations against an unnamed BBC presenter, that the presenter sent threatening messages to a second young person.
It's 5 o'clock, you're watching the News Hour. I'm Mark Austin. Coming up in the next 60 minutes. Another twist in the BBC crisis as a second young person makes allegations about one of its star presenters. They claim the male presenter sent threatening messages after they made contact on a dating app. Earlier, the BBC's boss admitted serious allegations were made in May and were not robustly followed up.
The first thing is immediately, do we raise the red flags quick enough on complaints of this nature? And the second is the processes and protocols. There may well be some learnings from this case.
Also tonight, mortgage rates hit the highest level for 15 years and Ukraine's president hits out at NATO leaders over delays to his country joining the alliance. Good evening. We begin the News Hour with another extraordinary twist in the crisis engulfing the BBC. Tonight, a second complainant has made allegations about one of the corporation's star presenters. They've told the BBC that the presenter contacted them on a dating app before sending them abusive messages. The complainant alleges that they felt threatened by the presenter's behaviour. These latest allegations follow separate claims in the Sun newspaper that the presenter paid a teenager for explicit photos. Our home editor, Jason Farrell, is following the story. So first of all, Jason, tell us more about the new complainant's allegations.
Well, this is another young person, separate person in their 20s who is alleged to have met the presenter in a dating app. They've then gone to a private chat room where the presenter has revealed themselves, wanted to meet up. This person has decided not to meet up with them. And then when suggesting that perhaps they go public with who this presenter is, has received threatening and intimidating messages, allegedly. We haven't seen those messages. I think it is really the nature of those messages and exactly what they contained that will be the concern around what has happened, whether or not they are criminal or whether they are simply unpleasant and inappropriate, we don't know. But nonetheless, it kind of adds to the idea of a mode of behaviour, a type of behaviour that this presenter may have been involved in, all adding to the claims and concerns. And I think adding to concerns for the BBC in a number of ways. First of all, it adds an additional complaint when they've been told to pause their investigation by the police. But obviously this is of a slightly different nature. So do the BBC investigate this separately? Do they pass this on to the police? I think probably a little bit of both. And secondly, you've got to look at this and go, well, the BBC reporters who've received this complaint seem to have, they're claiming they've done their due diligence. They've checked the phone number, for example, and seen that it is the phone number that's used by the presenter. They've contacted the presenter and asked for a response. These are all things that the corporate investigations team didn't do back in May. So they're making them look rather slow, outpacing them in the way in which they're responding to this new allegation. When the BBC have been trying to handle things at its own pace. I think that was the real message that was coming across from Tim Davie today, was he wanted to handle things at the right pace, do it correctly, due diligence, duty of care. But the problem is that events are outpacing the BBC, and perhaps it's simply not possible to do this at the pace in which the BBC wants to.
Very much for the moment. Just stay there, because we'll talk again about the other allegations, the other set of allegations facing the BBC's presenter. The corporation revealed today that it made just 2 attempts to contact a family which alleged that the presenter paid their teenage child for explicit images. The broadcaster says Director General Tim Davie and the presenter at the centre of the claims were only told of the complaint when the BBC was contacted by the Sun newspaper. That was almost 7 weeks after the complaint was originally made. Well, Sky News has asked the BBC's Director General for an interview but has had no response. However, Tim Davie did give one interview to BBC Radio, so let's delve into what he had to say. First, Mr Davie addressed why there were only 2 efforts made to contact the family.
As Director General, I want to make sure and look at a couple of things, actually. The first thing is immediately, do we raise the red flags quick enough on complaints of this nature? And the second is the processes and protocols. There may well be some learnings from this case. The one thing linked to your introduction is the case was kept open. So that does not mean we'd finished. We have a process where we keep going back, we leave a bit of time, and then we go back. So the case was kept
Left
open.
an awful lot of time when you consider that was from, what, the 18th, 19th of May through to last Thursday.
Well, as you can see from the timeline, they were contacted. There was no response. We can debate how many times that should have happened, but the allegations were taken seriously.
Well, Tim Davie was then questioned over why there was a delay in notifying the presenter involved.
If you've got an allegation coming into a corporate investigations team, and I think you need to balance the concerns of duty of care, privacy, all those things I've talked about. I don't think you take that complaint direct to a presenter. If you just work that through, if anything that comes through or any call that hasn't been verified just gets brought in front of someone, what I would say is it is important at that point. I think this is right to validate that, to have our, not just the audit services team, but the specialists talk to that individual, understand their concerns and go through that process.
Well, Mr Davie was also asked whether he had personally spoken to the presenter at the heart of these allegations.
I'm not going to get into the specific conversations with the presenter.
Have you spoken to him?
Personally, no. He's been spoken to by a senior manager.
Has he offered to resign?
Again, that is a matter that I think we have to respect the privacy of an employee.
Except we're in a very strange situation, aren't we, in that he's not been named, but everyone in this building knows who it is. And there are an awful lot of people who you also have a duty of care to, male presenters on air, who are having to go on air to say that it's not them. It's not a sustainable situation, is it?
It is a very difficult and complex situation, and we're trying to calmly and judiciously navigate our way through quite difficult circumstances.
And Mr Davie was then asked how damaging this crisis was for the BBC.
One thing I would say is these are clearly damaging to the BBC. It's not a good situation. But I think there's a few things as Director General I care deeply about. One is the ability for our newsroom to report independently, without fear or favour. And I made the case today, and you mentioned the annual report, 71% of the world doesn't even have a free press, or totally free press as we speak. So I think the BBC, by going at the story absolutely independently, maintains strong levels of trust.
Tim Davie there. Let's bring in our home editor, Jason Farrell, once again. So, Jason, that was the interview given by the Director General, and the crisis for the BBC clearly growing, and it will get more criticism for this failure to pursue these complaints back in May robustly.
Yeah, I think you got that impression there from the Director General that, you know, there may be some lessons to learn, but there are certainly processes that were followed that weren't necessarily followed in the wrong way. But, you know, where you heard him say there, you know, not every complaint, you know, would be referred to the presenter, for example. But this isn't every complaint. You know, this isn't just a random complaint. This is a complaint that he himself said was taken very seriously, that was referred up, that was logged, that was looked at by the investigations team. So it's gone up. It's been considered very serious, even though not criminal at this stage. And they have then sent an email to try and get verification. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that they then send this email, don't get a response, and then leave it 3 weeks before they make a phone call. And we're talking about, you know, what's been alleged as, you know, a potential safeguarding issue here. You then get a delay from the phone call that they don't get a pickup on of a month. And there's then a month, and then they get bitten, basically. They get bitten by the Sun newspaper. Right, by this time, the family's gone to the Sun newspaper. Now, you could say, well, maybe the family should have responded to the email, maybe they should have picked up the phone. But nonetheless, they've decided to go to the Sun newspaper, so suddenly it becomes public. And then the presenter is told. This is the first time after 7 weeks. And I think that's something that the public will find difficult to get their heads around. I think the other thing the public would have expected is for the Director General to speak to that presenter themselves. This is something that's become a big scandal that's brewing within the BBC. But Tim Davie saying no, that wasn't appropriate. He was handling it in his own way, and it was a senior manager that had spoken to the presenter. So those are some of the issues around this. And then I think the other issues is the things that we've not quite got to the bottom of from what we got from that interview, nor the press conference that was given. And the press conference it wasn't on TV, it wasn't filmed, it was done over Zoom. We weren't allowed to record it. The questions weren't asked in person. They were typed questions that were asked through a BBC person. And the question that I asked was, what is the difference? Because the BBC has been accused of lying by the family. The family say that they made it perfectly clear the level of allegations that were being made, i.e. that a young person was being asked to send explicit photographs when they are under the legal age of being able to do that by this presenter. That's the allegation. So what was the difference between what the BBC was told on the 19th of May when this complaint came through and what was published in the Sun newspaper? And all that Mr. Davey was able to say is that at that point the assessors didn't deem it to be criminal. So it doesn't quite say, exactly why. Why didn't they deem it to be criminal? What was missing from the Sun story that wasn't there in the original complaint? So there are still questions around that as well. And I think now that we've got this other complainant coming forward, Mr. Davey, obviously, he wants to try and contain it as much as possible, to keep this at a pace that the BBC can handle. But I think these things are stacking up, and there are so many unanswered questions, so many allegations floating around. I think that becomes ever more difficult.
Right, and just finally, for now, Jason, how long do you think it is tenable for this presenter to remain unnamed?
Well, I have to say one of the most kind of shocking things in a way from that interview was when the presenter said everyone in the building knows who it is. If every single person in the BBC building knows who it is, obviously this starts to disseminate through the general public, through the media, through politicians. I think there's only a certain amount of time before everybody knows who it is, and I think that becomes ever more difficult. And obviously you have a diminishing pool of presenters as more appear on air and more people come out and say it isn't them. So I don't know. I don't quite know how the BBC handles this. If they feel that they have to keep that anonymity and they say it is their duty of care to that presenter, that they have to consider that. But it kind of becomes overridden simply by the fact that the name is getting out there more and more.
OK, Jason, thank you very much indeed. Let's speak to Mark Bukowski now, a media industry commentator, PR branding expert. Good evening, Mark. And we spoke on this programme last night, and things are, well, they're moving pretty quickly. I just wonder, how does this, latest allegation, this latest complainant change things, do you think?
Well, it is extraordinary that just as one blanket is put on the fire, another one opens out. And I think, if you're looking for any positivity at the BBC, which there can't be much around at the moment, the impartiality of its news team is quite incredible. They are breaking the story on the very organisation that employs them. And they are going at it, with aplomb. So I think for all the critics of the BBC and their impartiality, this is a good day for the BBC News team. Look, it's not good, and I think, I said to you yesterday, Mark, we don't know the end of this. We have no idea. The only person who knows where this thing might lead to next is the person at the centre of this unnamed presenter. And whenever you're dealing with crisis, you've got to know the full picture. And whether or not it strikes me that both the BBC and also the presenter is being led by my learned friends, by the legal aspects towards this. But they're hanging on with their fingernails, and it looks like they're fighting a war equipped with a baseball bat while everybody else has got machine guns. And the speed of which the BBC are acting is glacial. And by their own reporting, from Sarah Montague there, they are so slow. And I find it extraordinary the DG would not be speaking to the key person in this for his own point of view, and to hand it down to a procedural level. And again, I can only think that he hasn't spoken to them at the moment because there's a legal aspect to it I don't understand. But it's not good enough where social media, 24 news cycle are now driving the story. And according to the Daily Mail, 1 in 6 people in this country know the identity of the person. Yeah. And it won't be long before I suspect a attention-seeking MP will get up and name him. And we've seen it before in the case of other individuals who've tried to hide behind super injunction. It doesn't work. And there needs to be a strategy now to think about how this is going to be unfolded.
Well, and also, so often in these cases, as you will know, one allegation does tend then to lead to others. And of course, we don't know where this will lead, but there is another one today.
Indeed. And is there more? Is this the end of the story? As I said, only one person knows. Look, it's been a tactic of the police in the past. It's been a tactic of, lots of people to out a story, to draw more people. It's a fishing exercise. You lead with one story and you hope you're going to find more people to make your case robust. This is slightly happening in reverse. It's incredibly difficult for the BBC because I think what we're witnessing is an organisation that is in shock. Right at the top of the organisation, where they've put due process in, because let's look at, what's happened. Post Savile, we've had the Cliff Richard incident, we've had Martin Bashir, and now we've had this. This is a tsunami of attacks on a reputation, and it was very honest for the DG Tim Davie to admit that it's not a good day for the BBC, and it's not a good day for the organisation and the due processes that they're trying to enact. When the story is out of control. And I think that they felt yesterday they had some semblance and control on it. But of course, it's been taken out of their hands again. And that again is because perhaps the contact with the individual in the centre of this, the unnamed presenter, is that he is shielding the truth. Because if someone has got issues, it's not the aim of a lawyer or even a PR man to get to the bottom of those issues. Needs help. Needs help at this help. Now, I mean, there's possibly nothing illegal happening here. I mean, obviously the police didn't feel there was a case, but someone in the old days, Mark, as you well know, one of the great PR tactics was to hive you off your clients to an institution, where they were calling for calm and they were going for treatment and they were looking, for some respite. That tactic is long worn out now. And of course, this is covered with top lawyers who are playing the privacy card. And of course, the double question is this of public interest or is this interesting? Well, the way this is being handled, it is becoming something of public interest. And that will actually greatly affect the legal position on this.
Yeah. OK, Mark, thank you very much for coming on again. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Let's just get some breaking news now. And a people smuggler has been jailed for more than 12 years for the manslaughter of 39 migrants who were found dead in a lorry trailer in Essex back in 2019. Marius Mihai Dragici pleaded guilty at the Old Bailey last month to 39 counts of manslaughter and also conspiracy to assist unlawful immigration. He fled the country after the bodies were discovered and was detained by police in Romania last August and returned to the UK. Now, the average interest rate on a 2-year fixed mortgage has hit its highest level in 15 years, exceeding levels seen following Liz Truss's mini-budget last year. The typical 2-year fixed rate residential mortgage is now 6.66%. The last time it was higher was in August 2008. Our business presenter, Ian King, is in the city. Good evening, Ian. So the highest rate since the financial crisis. How bad do you think it could get for homeowners?
Well, it will probably continue to get worse as the Bank of England continues to raise interest rates, Mark, because don't forget, mortgage rates are essentially priced off something called the swaps curve, which tends to move in close correlation with two-year gilts, UK government bonds, and that, of course, is in turn affected by what the Bank of England does with its main policy rate, bank rate. And if you take into account the fact that the market is currently pricing in bank rate to peak in this cycle at between 6.25% and 6.5%, you are going to see mortgage rates climbing higher from here. I suspect there's a lot of evidence in the market now. Indeed, I've been speaking to a mortgage broker this afternoon on Sky News, in which he said he's seeing a lot of people now coming to him to fix, even though they don't necessarily like the coming rates. These are people that have come off fixes in the recent past. They'd gone on to a variable mortgage rate because they were hoping that interest rates might come down in the short term. They're now coming to the conclusion that rates are going to remain at these elevated levels for quite a while, and accordingly they're fixing. At the same time, I should say, Mark, you're also seeing fewer mortgage products on the market, and you're starting to see lenders, particularly on these higher loan-to-value loans, starting to perhaps tighten up their terms and conditions a bit more there as well. But of course, this speculation about further interest rate rises, well, we had another big dose of it today. We got the employment and wages data out first thing this morning. Wages in the 3 months to the end of May grew at some 7.3%. That was the same as the 3 months to the end of April. Outside of the pandemic, it's the highest level that's been seen since the records began being compiled in this way. Private sector wage growth, this is regular average wages, excluding bonuses. They grew at 7.7% in the period, again, a record outside the pandemic period. In the public sector, they grew by 5.8%. And again, you have to go all the way back to September to November 2001, since you last saw public sector wages growing at that sort of level. It is confirmation that it's an incredibly tight labour market, and where employers are keen to get people onto the payroll, they're having to bid up their salaries accordingly. But this is not what the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee wants to see. It's already said that wage inflation at these sort of levels is not compatible with it getting inflation back to its target rate of 2%. And I think, therefore, the numbers that we had out today, and bear in mind we get the official headline inflation data tomorrow, it's probably all pointing to another interest rate rise when the Monetary Policy Committee next meets on the 3rd of August.
Right, OK. Ian, thanks very much. You're watching the NewsHour. Coming up, President Zelensky has some pretty harsh words for NATO leaders as he arrives at the Alliance's summit in Lithuania.
Gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Take you live to Manchester Crown Court.
Sky News Daily Podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Download for free now.
The Secretary-General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, says Ukraine will become a member of NATO, but only when allies agree and when conditions are met. The announcement has brought criticism from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who said it's absurd a timeline hasn't been set out for his country to join. Well, leaders have gathered in Vilnius in Lithuania for NATO's summit. Let's speak then to our political editor, Beth Rigby, who is there. Good evening, Beth. And, well, I mean, Zelensky has a point. He's pretty angry that there's no sort of timeline being set. But I guess the problem is there's no real unity within NATO as to when Ukraine should be admitted.
That's right, Mark. Look, there's sort of three big themes here, if you like. One was the issue of Sweden's accession into NATO, a big barrier overcome last night with Turkey now agreeing that Sweden can join. There's a second matter going on, which is a group of allies wanting to provide further long-term assistance for Ukraine, a buffer, if you like, to not full membership, but what more long-term military support can they provide? That's countries like the US and UK. It was discussed at the G7 in Japan. We might hear more on that. But then the big issue which is emerging tonight is the matter of when Ukraine can join NATO. And you are absolutely right. There is a split within the 31 strong members of NATO as to when this should happen. And they have tonight published a communique which really has drawn a broadside from a very frustrated President Zelensky, who arrived in Vilnius saying it's unprecedented and absurd that no time frame for membership or invitation has been issued by NATO. NATO have released the communique in the past hour or so, and they have said we agreed to issue an invitation when allies agree and conditions are met. One olive branch, if you like, was a decision to remove obstacles on the membership path. So Ukraine can join more quickly after the war has ended. But Mark, you're absolutely right. There is a split here. What is going on is countries like the UK and Poland and the Baltic nations, more countries on the eastern flank of NATO, if you like, are more positive about setting out a clearer timetable for Ukraine to join. Indeed, the Prime Minister on the plane over this morning told us he wanted to see demonstrable progress in that direction. And then there's caution from other allies like Germany and US, who are more cautious about setting a timetable and want more conditionality. And what you have in the communique, it is a fudge, if you like, whereby President Zelensky's certainly not satisfied, but you've got to get 31 countries to agree. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has just been speaking to a crowd in central Vilnius, and he said that adding Ukraine to the military alliance would make NATO would make Ukraine safer, and Ukraine will make NATO stronger. But disappointment for the president that there's no real clearer pathway to that happening. From an ally's perspective, they simply don't want to make that commitment when they're still in the middle of the conflict.
No. OK, Beth, thank you very much indeed. You're watching the News Hour. Coming up, following today's revelation of a second complainant in the case of the unnamed BBC presenter, we'll speak to The Guardian's former editor-in-chief and media commentator, Alan Rusbridger, next. Let's get more now on the crisis engulfing the BBC and new allegations against one of the corporation's star presenters. A second person has come forward with a complaint saying they felt threatened by the unnamed star at the centre of the row. They reportedly said they were put under pressure to meet up but never did. Let's speak to Alan Rusbridger, the editor of Prospect and who now heads the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, former editor of The Guardian. Good evening, Alan. Good to talk to you. And I guess, first of all, these new allegations, as is in the way of these things, you know, the allegations gain pace, it seems, after the first story.
Yeah, I mean, this is a different kind of allegation. It's an allegation that somebody in their 20s, not in their teens, met on a dating app and, as they said, felt under some pressure to meet. And when that was rejected, it is suggested that they might name this BBC presenter online, at which point the BBC presenter got hostile and abusive. So that's what the second allegation seems to amount to.
Yeah, and interesting, this is BBC News reporting, we should say. I mean, just how significant is that? Because, you know, the BBC investigating itself is you know, something that is, you know, must be very difficult for BBC journalists in one way.
Well, I think in any other company, an allegation like that would be, I suppose the question is, it's really an HR issue, the second one. It's the question is whether it is bringing the reputation of the BBC into disrepute in a way that means it should be treated in a way other than a personal matter. And that looks to be really the problem that the BBC has got into in the first issue as well, about which we're gaining a little more clarity by the day. But I had to say there's still quite a lot of fog surrounding who knew what and who did what at what point.
Right, and so on this point, Tim Davie was speaking today, the Director General, and the timeline of events is interesting. They admit that the initial allegations were serious, and yet there were only these two attempts, one email and one phone call that didn't connect a week or so later to re-establish contact with this family. Do you think that they will come under increasing criticism for that?
Well, there are two questions. What were they told in that first contact? And then what did they do? The stepfather of the young man, or sorry, the young person writing in The Sun today said as follows: I told the BBC I had gone to the police in desperation, but they couldn't do anything, as they said it wasn't legal. And so I take that to mean the BBC, they said they couldn't do anything, as the police said
it wasn't criminal.
Illegal.
It wasn't criminal, you mean? Yeah.
Well, what the word he used was illegal.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
So listening to Tim Davie today, he said, look, we get many such allegations against members of the BBC, and we look into them all. I think many people will think, depending on what they were told, that it looks a bit subpar, their response, a bit underpowered, and I think that's where they're most vulnerable.
Because they said after the whole Savile episode that they had got this sort of red flag process in place that would, you know, going forward would be used. The suggestion that it was not pursued because on the face of it there was no criminality involved. I mean, is that the standard that should be applied to these things?
Well, that's where we don't know. We don't know what it was, that we don't know what they were told. I mean, the curious thing in this whole story is that normally what a newspaper does is to say, we name the guilty man, or we name the guilty person. What the Sun has been doing is saying, well, we don't want to name the guilty person, but would you be so kind to name the guilty person yourself? That suggests to me that the Sun is aware that there are legal difficulties in naming the person. So effectively, they're trying to pass the legal difficulties to the BBC. And I'm sure the BBC has had the same advice, that there are legal difficulties here in terms of coming out into the open about something which, if we're to believe what the stepfather is saying, the police initially said wasn't illegal.
What do you make of the Sun's position on this? You know, they were, as you say, they haven't named the presenter. Do you? I mean, they could have named him and claimed public interest, I guess, if they'd had more evidence, it seems.
Well, that's the big question. I think it is mysterious they haven't named him. I mean, if the story was pitched as high as they were pitching it initially in terms of the public interest, they could have argued that the public interest defence in court if there was a subsequent legal action. It feels to me as though they feel on not entirely solid ground, just looking at it from the outside. And they've been goading the BBC into trying to do their dirty work for them. I name this person. But the BBC is clearly in the same problem that the Sun itself is in.
And what do you think of these, the fact that these allegations were not put, it seems, to senior management at the BBC, nor put to the presenter for some 7 weeks, and only then because they were told that the Sun was going to run a story?
Well, this is the difficulty in looking in from the outside, because we don't know the nature of what they were told. Clearly, if what they were told was something extremely credible and serious, backed up by phone numbers and emails and the kind of evidence that the Sun says they've got, then the BBC looks sluggardly and it looks as though the red flags aren't working. If it was something less than that, I mean, every journalist is used to people walking in off the street making all kinds of claims which don't go very far. If it was in the nature of that, the initial contact, then it may be that the BBC has got some wriggle room.
And just finally, I mean, how sustainable is it, do you think, for the anonymity of the presenter at the heart of all this to be sustained?
It's very difficult for the BBC. And at some point, people are going to put two and two together, the general public, and say, well, why isn't X on the television? It feels a unsustainable position. On the other hand, this is a career-destroying, possibly criminal allegation that's been made. And I think even in the age of social media, the BBC and any employer owes it to their employee to go through due process before outing them in a way that would be really terrible for the person concerned.
Yeah, I said finally, I got one more. I mean, do you, on this question of the BBC pausing its investigation because the police are looking at this, do you think that's the right thing to do, or is it just, you know, a little bit convenient for the BBC to just kick it over to the police?
I think if the police have asked them to pause, then they should pause, and the police are much better placed to investigate these kinds of things. I mean, there's going to be a lot of forensic detail that will help establish whether we're talking about something that is illegal or distasteful or reputationally damaging to the BBC. And depending on how that falls out, the BBC will make a decision about the future of this person. It's really difficult because in a social media age, there is intense pressure and other BBC presenters must be fuming. But on the other hand, there is a process and that must be followed.
Alan Rusbridger, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you. You're watching the NewsHour. Coming up, hitting the right note at Wimbledon. Success for the player who gave up Harry Styles tickets to play on centre court.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. When you think of Glastonbury, it's mud you want and music. They're going to cross to us live in a minute. Okay. Thank you so much. Brad Pitt is now a prolific producer behind the scenes.
It's not a mystery to me. We always were capable of doing this.
Oh, they're wonderful children as an audience.
Who did that? Maverick here on the red carpet. I'm so excited, Tom Cruise. This is the story of the night.
It's the little independent film that could.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
Nor have I ever struck any woman in my life.
There's this illusion of power.
Are you feeling well? I remember covering the Oscars and that now infamous moment, the Will Smith slap. Nobody could quite believe that it had happened. You can tell from these crowds just how excited people are for the return of Pride.
These actors playing the lead roles were born long after the Sex Pistols broke up.
Are you pleased that you did say yes to the job?
I've never regretted it.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
Don't leave me.
Yeah, okay.
There's no easy goodies. There's no easy baddies.
I've had a great time here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Let's get more now on another twist in the crisis engulfing the BBC. Tonight, a second complainant has made allegations about one of the corporation's star presenters. They've told the BBC that the presenter contacted them on a dating app before sending them abusive messages. The complainant alleges that they felt threatened by the presenter's behaviour. These latest allegations follow separate claims in the Sun newspaper that the presenter paid a teenager for explicit photos. Let's speak to former BBC editor, now Professor of Journalism, Tim Luckhurst. Good evening. Thank you for being with us. And I just wonder how these new allegations change things for the BBC and for this presenter.
Well, the BBC went into today expecting to have to answer very tough questions about the original allegations in The Sun. And I thought the Director General did a very effective job in answering questions when he explained that he was going to look carefully at the nature of the BBC's complaints process and make sure that it moved at the right speed in highlighting really serious allegations which needed to be looked at by senior executives. That was a good performance, but he'd hardly finished speaking when the new allegations emerged against the presenter. Now, this is going to refocus the attention on the BBC, and it's going to turn what was already a difficult situation into an even more sticky one. It's clear that this presenter has got some very serious questions to answer, but at the same time, the presenter is protected by privacy law. He can't be identified, and as a result, the Director General has got quite a serious difficulty on his hands.
Yeah, and you say, Tim Day, you put up a pretty good performance. I mean, the timeline of events, though, does show, and he admitted that the initial allegations were serious, does show this timeline that only 2 attempts were made to re-establish contact with the family. And this, Tim, from an organisation that said after the whole Savile thing that they had a new red flag process and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that Tim Davie was very honest and candid about his own concern that the complaint may not have been red flagged sufficiently quickly and that it hadn't been escalated up the BBC's chain of command at the right speed. Now, I think that he is right to make that, to identify that problem, because clearly 7 weeks between the original approach by the people who made the complaint to the BBC and it actually reaching the senior executive level is a very long time. And only one email and one phone call in those 7 weeks does really suggest that this was not given the priority that in retrospect it certainly deserves. Tim Davie was candid about that, but now he's got a new problem and it's not one I would like to have to deal with.
No, absolutely. I mean, it was 7 weeks before it reached senior management and 7 weeks also before anyone put these allegations to the presenter.
Yes, that's right. And it seems that may have been a little bit too slow, particularly in light of what has now emerged. Look, I'm a big fan of the BBC. I really do admire our national broadcaster. I think it sets a standard and it's well regarded around the world. But to say that it's got a problem at the moment is absolutely fair. It has got a problem. And that problem has been brought to its door by another great British institution, a really successful, popular newspaper. I suppose the one thing that I feel slightly relieved about is that at least one part of journalism is doing its job, and at the same time BBC journalists are doing a very fair job of asking tough questions of their Director General. We're a strange country in which an organisation employs its own journalists to question its boss, but at the BBC that is what happens, and I think we're better for it.
Yeah, and we should say also that the latest allegations are actually from BBC reporting, and I mean, how significant do you think it is?
Well, it's a peculiar place in the UK, isn't it, where a BBC Director General is held to account by his own news team, where BBC reporters are in exactly the same position as reporters working for independent television news companies, that they're expected to question the BBC boss as ruthlessly and efficiently as they can. Well, they've done that, and BBC reporting has been honest and candid. But I know that there are an awful lot of people in the BBC newsroom who wish that the BBC could identify this presenter. They know why he can't. They understand the law of privacy. They are well trained and they understand what the rules currently are. But it is putting a great deal of pressure on many BBC staff who would like to make it absolutely clear that it wasn't them and who don't like the notion that there are members of the public out there who still think that it could be one of several BBC presenters. Well, that's going to have to remain the case until the individual concerned is identified. And I think that that might happen if MPs decide to use parliamentary privilege, which would be the one way at the moment that that name could emerge without anybody facing a defamation suit.
Yeah, and just finally, we should say there's no suggestion of criminality in all this so far. Of course, the police are looking at the evidence and the information from the first set of allegations, but
that's absolutely right.
But it's clearly not a good look.
It's not a good look, but there are no criminal charges. But you're right, the police are still scoping this. So it is conceivable that criminal charges or criminal investigation might emerge. At the moment, there is no allegation of criminality.
Tim, thank you very much for coming on. Appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching the News Hour on Sky News. Let's cross over to Sky Sports now for an update with Chris.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
Wimbledon in full bloom, one of the most glorious scenes in all of sport. It's a place this man has got to know well. Cam Norrie cycled to the championships and all the way to the last four last year. So how much does he feel sustainability? Time to find out.
Here he is. Hey, Cam. How are you doing? All
Very
good?
well, thank you. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
What is it like to be back here?
Can't complain, so nice, especially when the weather's like this.
Yeah. So, do you fancy having a little wander around, reliving some memories, chatting a bit of climate?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Come on.
Cam, court 16. Talk to me.
Yeah, I remember actually, it was my first ever main draw men's win here, so very special court for me.
What did that feel like? Did it
feel like a major moment for you?
I think it was one of those days I was so nervous for the match, so tight because I'd never won a match here, and I just really wanted to get over the line. So I think it was more of a relief more than like enjoying it.
So what about climate and climate change? When did you first sort of have exposure to this topic, I guess?
Yeah, I actually remember taking a sustainability class at TCU, where I went to university in the States, and one of the things that stood out for me was, I don't know why, but it was in the Netherlands, how many people bike to work there, and I was thinking, like, for me, why can't I do the same? And around London, when I'm here, I'm biking to practice, and definitely it's a good warm-up, good cool-down, and yeah, growing up in New Zealand, everyone's pretty conscious of everything. They're protecting the beaches and my parents and the way I was raised, so I was always kind of thinking of it, and then with the adding it into university and learning a little bit more, I became a bit more interested in it.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's have a look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Southern Europe is heating up, but it will be on the cool side here, with that rather unsettled weather continuing. There will be showers around this evening, some heavy and thundery and also prolonged, mainly in the north and the west. There will be further showers overnight, which will move eastwards, but much of central and eastern England and eastern Scotland look dry. It'll be a little cooler and fresher than recently, especially in the southeast. Showers will spread to most parts tomorrow morning, becoming heavy and thundery in places again, but there'll be some sunshine too. Northern parts look most at risk of slow-moving thunderstorms. It'll be rather cool for most and breezy in the south, especially near Channel coasts. The afternoon will be similar, but Central Ireland will be mainly fine, while central Britain will turn drier later.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
This is the News Hour. Coming up, more allegations against the unnamed presenter at the centre of the BBC crisis. This is the News Hour at 6. I'm Mark Austin, coming up in the next 60 minutes. Another twist in the BBC crisis as a second young person makes allegations about one of its star presenters. They claim the male presenter sent threatening messages after they made contact on a dating app. Earlier, the BBC's boss admitted serious allegations were made in May and were not robustly followed up.
The first thing is immediately, do we raise the red flags quick enough on complaints of this nature? And the second is the processes and protocols. There may well be some learnings from this case.
Also tonight, mortgage rates hit the highest level for 15 years. Ukraine's president hits out at NATO leaders over delays to his country joining the alliance. And we speak to the foreign fighters on the front line of Ukraine's counter-offensive against Russia. Good evening. We start with another extraordinary twist in the crisis engulfing the BBC. Tonight, a second complainant has made allegations about one of the corporation's star presenters. They've told the BBC that the presenter contacted them on a dating app before sending them abusive messages. The complainant alleges that they felt threatened by the presenter's behaviour. These latest allegations follow separate claims in the Sun newspaper that the presenter paid a teenager for explicit photos. Sky's Sadia Chowdhury is at the BBC's central London headquarters. Sadia, tell us more about what the new complainant is alleging.
Well, this is a new complainant, as you say, someone in their early 20s who says that they are no connection to the first claimant. That is the person that we heard from in the Sun newspaper. This person says that they met this presenter, who is the same presenter from the Sun newspaper article, that they met on a dating app and that they spoke for a while, and after that the conversation moved on to a private chat. And it is there that the presenter, according to this young person, revealed who they actually are. And when this young person felt under pressure, didn't want to meet up, and said that they would go online and reveal who this person is, they say they then received messages from this presenter which were threatening and abusive. And BBC News, who have spoken to this person, say that they've seen those messages. And it is the nature of those messages that will be key here, and to establish whether or not anything criminal was happening. What it does is add this new layer of complexity on this case. Not only does it create a pattern of problematic behaviour now attached, alleged problematic behaviour attached to this presenter, but also is an additional complainant to one that the BBC were already facing.
OK, Sadia, stay there for just a moment, because we want to talk now about the other set of allegations facing the BBC presenter. And the corporation revealed today that it made just 2 attempts to contact a family which alleged that the presenter paid their teenage child for explicit images. The broadcaster says Director General Tim Davie and the presenter at the centre of the claims were only told of the complaint when the BBC was contacted by the Sun newspaper. That was almost 7 weeks after the original complaint was made. Sky News has asked the BBC's Director General for an interview, but has had no response. However, Tim Davie did give one interview to BBC Radio, so let's delve into what he had to say in that. First, Mr. Davie addressed why there were only 2 efforts made to contact the family.
As Director General, I want to make sure and look at a couple of things, actually. The first thing is immediately, do we raise the red flags quick enough on complaints of this nature? And the second is the processes and protocols. There may well be some learnings from this case. The one thing linked to your introduction is the case was kept open. So that does not mean we'd finished. We have a process where we keep going back, we leave a bit of time, and then we go back. So the case was kept open.
Left an awful lot of time, when you consider that was from, what, the 18th, 19th of May through to last Thursday?
Well, as you can see from the timeline, they were contacted, there was no response. We can debate how many times that should have happened, but the allegations were taken seriously.
Well, Tim Davie was then questioned over why there was delay in notifying the presenter involved.
If you've got an allegation coming into a corporate investigations team, and I think you need to balance the concerns of duty of care, privacy, all those things I've talked about, I don't think you take that complaint direct to a presenter. If you just work that through, if anything that comes through or any call that hasn't been verified just gets brought in front of someone, what I would say is it is important at that point, I think this is right, to validate that, to have our, not just the audit services team, but the specialists talk to that individual, understand their concerns and go through that process.
Mr Davie was then asked whether he had personally spoken to the presenter at the heart of the allegations.
I'm not going to get into the specific conversations with the presenter.
Have you spoken to him?
Personally, no. He's been spoken to by a senior manager.
Has he offered to resign?
Again, that is a matter that I think we have to respect the privacy of an employee.
Except we're in a very strange situation, aren't we, in that he's not been named, but everyone in this building knows who it is. And there are an awful lot of people who you also have a duty of care to, male presenters on air, who are having to go on air to say that it's not them. It's not a sustainable situation, is it?
It is a very difficult and complex situation, and we're trying to calmly and judiciously navigate our way through quite difficult circumstances.
And Mr Davie was then asked how damaging the crisis was for the BBC.
One thing I would say is these are clearly damaging to the BBC. It's not a good situation. But I think there's a few things as Director General I care deeply about. One is the ability for our newsroom to report independently, without fear or favour. And I made the case today, and you mentioned the annual report, 71% of the world doesn't even have a free press, or totally free press as we speak. So I think the BBC, by going at the story absolutely independently, maintains strong levels of trust.
Tim Davie there. Let's go back to Sadia now at the BBC. So the crisis is gathering pace for the corporation, and it will face more criticism for not investigating more thoroughly at the outset.
Yeah, and you heard there Tim Davie talking about the need to be calm and judicious in the way they investigate this. And perhaps he thought he would have that time to be calm, because just 24 hours ago we were standing here talking about that explosive development where the lawyer had sent a letter from the original complainant saying that all of this stuff that we read in the Sun newspaper were complete rubbish. Of course, it's not up to any alleged victim to determine what is lawful or not, but the BBC has been criticised about the perceived delay in which it investigated this. It says that it initially received the complaint on the 18th of May. The next day, this was escalated to the corporate investigations team, and they tried to email the complainant. They didn't hear back from them. And then 3 weeks later, they made a phone call, just one phone call. That phone call didn't connect. There was no subsequent follow-up, and they said that the case remained open. And Tim Davie has spoken. He said that he understands that timetable. He didn't go as far as saying that he thinks it is a sensible one, but he says he understands it. But there's certainly a lot of criticism about the way they acted, and certainly now with the BBC News team doing what their investigation is much quicker and seeming to outpace the corporate investigations team is certainly something to note.
Sadia, thank you very much. And by the way, join us at 7 o'clock this evening for a special programme where we'll be looking at all the big questions about the allegations surrounding a BBC presenter. And if you scan the QR code on the screen, there it is, you can listen to the latest edition of the Sky News Daily podcast. Today, Kimberly Leonard is looking at the crisis at the BBC. You can subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts and on the Sky News app as well. Now, the average interest rate on a 2-year fixed mortgage has hit its highest level in 15 years, exceeding levels seen following Liz Truss's mini-budget last year. The typical 2-year fixed-rate residential mortgage is now 6.66%. The last time it was higher was in August 2008. Our business presenter Ian King has the latest from the city.
Don't forget, mortgage rates are essentially priced off something called the swaps curve, which tends to move in close correlation with two-year gilts, UK government bonds, and that, of course, is in turn affected by what the Bank of England does with its main policy rate, bank rate. And if you take into account the fact that the market is currently pricing in bank rate to peak in this cycle at between 6.25% and 6.5%, you are going to see mortgage rates climbing higher from here. I suspect there's a lot of evidence in the market now. Indeed, I've been speaking to a mortgage broker this afternoon on Sky News, in which he said he's seeing a lot of people now coming to him to fix, even though they don't necessarily like the coming rates. These are people that have come off fixes in the recent past. They'd gone onto a variable mortgage rate because they were hoping that interest rates might come down in the short term. They're now coming to the conclusion that rates are going to remain at these elevated levels for quite a while, and accordingly they're fixing. At the same time, I should say, Mark, you're also seeing fewer mortgage products on the market, and you're starting to see lenders, particularly on these higher loan-to-value loans, starting to perhaps tighten up their terms and conditions a bit more there as well. But of course, this speculation about further interest rate rises, well, we had another big dose of it today. We got the employment and wages data out first thing this morning. Wages in the 3 months to the end of May grew at some 7.3%. That was the same as the 3 months to the end of April. Outside of the pandemic, it's the highest level that's been seen since the records began being compiled in this way. Private sector wage growth, this is regular average wages, excluding bonuses. They grew at 7.7% in the period, again a record outside the pandemic period. In the public sector, they grew by 5.8%. And again, you have to go all the way back to September to November 2001 since you last saw public sector wages growing at that sort of level. It is confirmation that it's an incredibly tight labour market, and where employers are keen to get people onto the payroll, they're having to bid up their salaries accordingly. But this is not what the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee wants to see. It's already said that wage inflation at these sort of levels is not compatible with it getting inflation back to its target rate of 2%. And I think, therefore, the numbers that we had out today, and bear in mind we get the official headline inflation data tomorrow, it's probably all pointing to another interest rate rise when the Monetary Policy Committee next meets on the 3rd of August.
Ian King there. Time now for a look at some of these other top stories. And a people smuggler has been jailed for more than 12 years for the manslaughter of 39 migrants who were found dead in a lorry trailer in Essex in 2019. Marius Mihai Dragici pleaded guilty at the Old Bailey last month to 39 counts of manslaughter and conspiracy to assist unlawful immigration. He fled the country after the bodies were discovered and was detained by police in Romania last August and then returned to the UK. A jury has ruled that a 9-year-old girl who was stabbed in broad daylight last year was killed by Devidas Skibas. Lilia Valuti was killed in Boston, Lincolnshire last July whilst playing in the street. 23-year-old Skibas was deemed unfit to plead or to face a conventional trial due to his mental health. Carrie Johnson has announced the birth of her 3rd child with the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Mrs. Johnson revealed the news in an Instagram post with a picture of the couple's newborn son named Frank Alfred. She also thanked the NHS maternity team at the UCL London Hospital for their efforts. The Secretary-General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, says Ukraine will become a member of NATO, but only when allies agree and when conditions are met. The announcement has brought criticism from Ukraine's President Zelensky, who said it's absurd that a timeline hasn't been set out for his country to join. Leaders have gathered in Lithuania for the summit, with Stoltenberg saying Ukraine will get more military aid and an easing of formal conditions to join the alliance. But is that enough for Zelensky? Not really. Let's speak to our political editor, Beth Rigby, who's in Vilnius. And Beth, I mean, the problem is there's no real unity, it seems, in NATO on the question of when to bring Ukraine in.
Yeah, of course, Mark, that is exactly the problem. You've hit the nail on the head there. Look, there's three big themes here. The accession of Sweden, that crossed a hurdle last night when Erdogan of Turkey agreed to drop his resistance to that. The second theme is this military assistance package, more long-term support, not by the whole of NATO, but by a subset of allies, including the UK and US. Expect to hear more about that, and that in some way ameliorates or attempts to be a buffer zone to the big stumbling block for Ukraine at least, which is the big issue here about the language around Ukraine's accession to NATO. Now, President Zelensky wanted a clear commitment. He wanted a timetable. Our own Prime Minister told us this morning on the plane over he wanted to see demonstrable progress towards that goal. But quite simply, as you say, allies are divided. 31 different members in NATO all having to agree a language around this in the communique. What came out tonight? Well, no clear sign of a timetable, a NATO agreeing to issue invitation when all conditions are met. They also said that they would remove obstacles on the membership path. Now, they can take decades to fulfil. They fast-tracked Finland and Sweden through that process, a commitment here that they would somehow collapse that membership path for Ukraine as well, but only after the war, the conflict in Ukraine is over. Allies simply not prepared to set a timetable. Now, what's going on behind the scenes? Quite simply, there's a bunch of allies with the UK, Poland, some of the Baltic nations, some of those NATO allies on the eastern flank that would like a more accelerated programme for Ukraine. And then there's caution from two of the biggest operators in this alliance, Germany and the US, cautious about setting out any timetable whilst this conflict still goes on. And they've come up with a compromise which has left Zelensky very disappointed. He tweeted out tonight, "I embarked on a trip here with faith in decisions, with faith in partners, with faith in a strong NATO, and a NATO that does not hesitate, does not waste time. I would like this faith to be turned into confidence." Is that too much to expect? So the language is out, but President Zelensky, who is here in Vilnius, unhappy with that outcome, as will some of the NATO allies be as well.
Yeah, OK, Beth, thank you very much indeed. This is the News Hour at 6. Coming up, we report from Ukraine and hear from the foreign nationals fighting on the front line.
Incoming.
I'm Adam Parsons. I'm Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
More flares going off, a volley of rocks, cobbles have been pulled up out and are being used as missiles to hurl at these police.
We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
We have now left Italy and entered France. Nobody's asked to check our identity.
Made by people who dare to challenge.
Nice to see you again, Mr. Barnier. Why?
Meeting you. Fishing does have the potential to stymie an enormous economic deal. What strikes you when you come to this glacier is not just the way in which the environment is changing, but the speed at which those changes are happening.
It's devastating, actually.
Now, as NATO leaders gather in Lithuania, the war in Ukraine continues at pace. Alongside hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian nationals, foreign nationals have also joined the fight. But for some, frustration and fatigue are setting in. For months, the front lines were largely static, but the Ukrainians say they've now retaken around 100 square miles of territory in the counter-offensive. The main pushes have been south of Zaporizhzhia and in the east around Bakhmut and towards Donetsk, although progress has been slower than many in the West had hoped. Sky's international correspondent John Sparks has been speaking with an Irishman who's been fighting on the front lines in the east of the country, and he sent this report.
It's got to be unloaded. Unloaded? Yeah, unloaded bag.
They left the front in the dead of night with little fanfare on departure. A pair of foreign fighters who had taken up the Ukrainian cause. Hundreds, if not thousands, of international combatants have come to Ukraine's aid, much like the leaders of NATO, pledging support at the summit in Lithuania. But this small group has had enough. The train will take them home. The past few weeks on the Eastern Front have been the final straw. Ukraine's counter-offensive has struggled to achieve its objectives.
We're stuck!
As the Russians deploy mass artillery and minefields to slow the Ukrainians down.
Who's out there yelling?
The fighting has been brutal, although no one was killed in this incident. For the foreign fighters, there is a refuge near the front, a modest house in eastern Ukraine where the door is always open. And we met an Irishman there, a heavy machine gunner, who's been fighting in Ukraine for the past 17 months.
What is it like right now on the front line, the 0 point?
Zero line, it's horror. It's horror. There is just, it's a genocide. It's slaughter. There is just people dead everywhere. Russians dead, Ukrainian people dead, Ukrainian soldiers dead, just left there. Just left there, and I don't know why.
Reese Byrne says he was almost killed a few weeks ago as his multinational unit prepared to attack the line.
It keeps disconnecting all the bells, bro. We were told there's a Russian trench line, and our job is to go into the trenches and clear them out, hold them until auxiliary units come, and then we go home.
They were taken to a staging area, but they had no air cover. and a pair of Ukrainian tanks withdrew. In the distance, another tank approached, the unit assuming it was friendly.
But you're doing all right, though.
Yeah, I'm good.
But it wasn't. Soldiers took cover in the woods, hoping that assistance would arrive.
Any station, this is Bravo. Can anybody hear me? Can anybody read me? Go!
As the light fell, a Ukrainian truck pulled up and the survivors scrambled in the back. But Burns said they were spotted. A Russian tank giving chase.
Let's go!
Now we have the tank literally coming out, starting to chase us. And that's terrifying. When you see a big T-72 coming for you and you're in a Humvee pickup, yeah, it's like a hot knife through butter. You're finished. So again, all of us are screaming, drive the Humvee, drive the Humvee. I was going mental. I've never done like those big mountains like you have, but I want it, bro.
This sanctuary is run by a muscular pastor, a New Zealander called Owen Panoma.
What's the point of this place, this house?
Be some sort of support, you know, to sit there. Where are you from? You got kids, you know, basically to take their mind off war.
No one is pressured to communicate, but the trauma will often make itself known.
They sleep talk. They scream. Night time, you come out and go to the toilet, think, oh, it's all right, and the guys wake up, you know, they don't realise that what they're doing. They may not be aware of what they're actually doing because it's quiet here. Out there, it's not.
Byrne and a fellow fighter race to make their train, with the past quickly stuffed in their rucksacks. But they can't leave it all behind.
It's the only ticket I have, pal. This is a ticket you with me, boy.
These men have spent months on the edge.
Just become a memory from me, yeah? That's all it'll be, just a memory that I'll try push behind, that I hopefully forget. I genuinely hope I forget it, but I know it'll haunt me, it'll come back.
As NATO pledges arms, these men are pulling out, although their departure was delayed when the pair bought the wrong tickets. Turns out it was harder to leave than they thought. John Sparks, Sky News in eastern Ukraine.
Let me just bring you the latest pictures we're getting in from Lithuania, Vilnius, the capital, the NATO summit, and you can see there President Zelensky arriving for dinner with NATO leaders. Also there, his wife, Elena Zelenska. And as we've been hearing from Beth Rigby, President Zelensky unhappy with no clear-cut timeline for NATO membership for Ukraine. He said that was absurd, so it might just be an awkward dinner. President Zelensky arriving for it tonight. Let's have a look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Southern Europe is heating up, but it will be on the cool side here with unsettled weather continuing. There'll be showers around this evening, some heavy, thundery and prolonged, mainly in the north and the west.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
This is the News Hour at 6. Coming up, questions for the BBC today. But does the Sun newspaper also have questions to answer for its reporting? We'll be discussing all that next. Let's return to our top story and new claims against a BBC presenter, this time from another young person. Let's speak to Jonathan Code, a public relations and media management lawyer. Good evening, Jonathan. Thanks for being with us. So just first of all, how do you think the new allegations change things legally, if at all?
Well, I'm not sure they change things very much, because the situation remains that there is a sort of ambit of privacy, if you can imagine that, around every individual. And over a series of cases, including one very high-profile one brought against the BBC by Cliff Richard, while there are merely allegations floating about, your privacy right entitles you not to have those allegations aired in public. So the allegations concerning the obtaining of sexual images for money at the moment are merely allegations. There's been no formal police investigation, although that may come, and there's been no arrest, and there's been no charge. For these new ones, maybe the situation is slightly different, because the BBC says that it has the actual evidence. It's apparently been provided with these communications. So if it was that alone, then the BBC would be in a slightly different position, because they would be able to decide whether these allegations were well-founded or not. The problem they face is, of course, if they released the name of the individual who's accused of the second tranche of allegations, they would, by the same process, name him for the earlier allegations. So they really are in a rock and a hard place here.
Right. So, but what you're saying essentially is that there's no criminality as yet so far, and the police are looking, as you say, into that, means there's no need to change the situation on anonymity. Is that basically what you're saying?
Well, there's no need. I'm quite sure that the BBC would far rather not have to put Tim Davie in front of a reporter who beat him up during the course of the World at One and answer all these questions being thrown at them by the Sun. They would be able to solve a lot of it by simply saying, this is him. But they can't. It is just not that simple. They have duty of care obligations to him. They've got contractual obligations to him. He's got employment rights. He's got privacy rights, and he's got right not to be defamed. So for all of those reasons, the poor lawyers at the BBC are in a very difficult position trying to tell them what they should do in this situation.
Right, so no legal pressure on the presenter involved to, lose the anonymity. But what about this whole situation of social media where, frankly, it's a Wild West? There are legal protections because the police can do something about it, but do they enforce those legal protections very often?
No, they don't. And if you've acted for high-profile talent since before there even was social media, you know that it's very difficult to get an overworked and under-resourced police force to take time dealing with situations of social media unless they're really serious and allegations of of a threatening nature or obscene or whatever. So normally it's down to the high-profile individual wheeling in a lawyer like me to try and deal with them as best they can. But I think one other important point here, Mark, is that the BBC are being criticised for not naming this individual, and people are saying, well, that's meant that people like Gary Lineker and other high-profile BBC talent have had to go online or on air to defend themselves. But there are actually two organisations who have some kind of responsibility to name this individual, and the other is the Sun. This is all driven by the Sun. The Sun is saying, we've got all this evidence, we've got the bank transfers, we've got the pictures, we've got the evidence from the parents. Now, speaking as someone who's also legaled out films, television programs, books, newsprint, I can tell you that the law provides the Sun with an absolute defense if what they say about the evidence they've got is true. So the question arises, why hasn't the Sun named it?
Well, I guess that they would say that, I don't know, I'm not going to speak for the Sun, but because they said in their statement yesterday, we have seen evidence that supports their concerns, there being the mum and the stepfather in this case. And I guess you're right, they could have named the individual and claimed public interest, but I guess they, don't have sufficient evidence to be 100%, sure.
Mark, I don't want to give you or your viewers a lecture in the law because, they're all going to go to sleep and watch someone else.
Yeah.
But in putting it as shortly as I can, Section 4 of the Defamation Act provides a public interest defence, and it is exactly designed for situations like this. And in order to get this defence, and of course the Sun has an army of very good lawyers with whom I fought many times over the years, who really know their stuff. The Section 4 defence says that in order to have the freedom to publish this information, all you need to establish is two things. One, that the subject matter of the publication is a matter of public interest, which this obviously is. And the only other requirement is that you reasonably believed that publishing this information was in the public interest. Now, the Sun is shouting from the rooftops, this is all public interest stuff. It's really important it all comes out. Well, if that's right, you've got the Section 4 defence. Why haven't you published this man's name?
I mean, I guess that they will say that the latest allegations, to some extent, justify their original story.
I'm sure they do, and I'm sure they will, and I believe they indeed they have. But again, if they've got further evidence against this man, again, why haven't they named him? This is an organisation with, a Rupert Murdoch organisations with more money than several African countries, an absolute army of lawyers. They took on Johnny Depp. They made allegations against him that he's a wife beater on relatively flimsy information, as it turned out. I mean, they proved it at law, but it's not as if they're shrinking violets. You remember that the Mail named the murderers of Stephen Lawrence. Now that was very high risk because they're alleging that individuals were murderers. Well, they gutsed it out. They published it anyway. I'm kind of inclined to say, if Victoria Newton were there, well, come on, put your money where your mouth is. Let's find out what your evidence is and why you say that this person is guilty.
Yeah, okay, Jonathan, we've got to leave it there, but appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Just a little bit of breaking news on this very story. And Sky News has obtained a statement from a police force saying it had met the Metropolitan Police and the BBC back in April after being approached by the family of a young person who formed the basis of the first complaint against the BBC presenter. The force decided there was no criminality, but as a result of recent developments, they are making further inquiries to establish whether there is evidence of a criminal offence. Right, you're watching the News Hour at 6. Let's cross over now to Sky Sports News for an update.